Simplest thing. So what we're going to do, we're going to just go from like here all the way down, and we're going to discuss your organ responses to different stimulations, right? So let's start here. First one, in the head. What do we have? We have a bunch of glands. Does that make sense? So, I'm talking lacrimal, your tears, nasal, mucus in the nose, and salivary. Okay? Parasympathetic system, as we just discussed, stimulates, inhibits. The term that is often used, is that glands in the head are under parasympathetic control. Okay? So a couple of relevant clinical examples. I mentioned before the drug that is used to reduce your nasal congestion is phenylephrine. Okay? Phenylephrine is essentially a sympathomimetic. So it will inhibit the function of the nasal glands and will reduce the nasal discharge. Does that make sense? It will stimulate the sympathetic system and will reduce the nasal discharge. Are you with me so far? Another good example. Well, public speaking is kind of, part of my job description, so I'm fine with it, but I know that many of you don't like it, right? And you get really nervous when you have to do public speaking. You're going to get really nervous when it happens to your mouth. It dries. And it dries because when you're nervous, your sympathetic system goes up, stimulation, right? And it inhibits the function of your salivary glands. Good? I'm going to skip esophagus because it's kind of not super important. And we're going to jump directly to your respiratory system. The breathing rate is the thing in itself. It's weirdly regulated. It's kind of awkward. Generally speaking, sympathetic stimulation increases your breathing rate. Let's throw it. So, breathing rate. Sympathetic stimulation increases. Parasympathetic decreases. Which kind of makes sense if you think about this in the context of exercise, right? Good so far? Now a little bit trickier. We're going to do like 3 steps about respiratory system, which are kind of tricky. Airway diameter. So when you need to run, what happens to your airway diameter? What should happen? Diameter of your bronchi. Should they become wider or narrower? Wider. So sympathetic system essentially increases your airway diameter and parasympathetic decreases. I'm going to ask you kind of a trick question. It's not really a trick question, okay? But changing the diameter of the airways, is that a movement?
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's a movement, right? What kind of tissue moves? What kind of tissue moves things? Muscle, right? So it's some kind of a muscle that changes the diameter of your airways. Are you following me? Changes it like this. they can become narrower or they can become wider. It's a smooth muscle. So, smooth muscles of the airways. Which system inhibits them and which system stimulates them? I'm going to give you one hint. When you stimulate a muscle, it contracts. When you inhibit a muscle, it relaxes. So the answer is actually, like, you have to think, but the answer is on the board. You just have to kind of go from this to this. So which system stimulates, contracts smooth muscles of the airways? And which system relaxes?
Relaxes, contracts.
Perfect. Perfect. Very good. Okay? That makes sense? We're going to put dots so we can trace. Okay. We're done with airways. Our next step is the heart. So, cardiac activity can be categorized in two things: heart rate and force of contraction. Does that make sense? So, when you are excited or scared, what happens to your heart rate?
It increases.
Perfect. And when you are chilling on the couch, it decreases. Now, about the force of contraction, you cannot know that. So, well, first of all, how do you think sympathetic system changes the force of contraction, like when you're working out? Does your heart beat stronger or weaker when you're working out? Stronger, of course. So force of contraction is increased. Now, interestingly enough, parasympathetic system has no effect on the force of contraction. Okay? That makes sense. Now, vessel diameter. This is a really complicated issue, but for our intents and purposes, to clear my conscience, parasympathetic stimulation has very little effect. I mean, you can kind of show that acetylcholine dilates the blood vessels. I did it myself with his own hands. And norepinephrine constricts them. But you're basically doing it in the actual animal or human, parasympathetic system has very little effect on the vessel diameter, but for our sort of, if I ask you a question and you can't go into those details, that's what you say. Okay, we're good? Now, here's your rest and digest. We never mentioned pupils, I'm sorry. Can you write down pupils? I forgot about pupils. So, parasympathetic constricts pupils, sympathetic dilates pupils. And it makes sense too, because if you're threatened, pupillary dilation kind of allows you to absorb more visual information. Okay? Right, so digestive and renal. renal/urinary. Now you're going to have complete opposite. So sympathetic system, it inhibits both. While parasympathetic stimulates both. Okay? So basically when you are sitting on the couch, your digestive and urinary systems work really actively. And that's kind of, one of the, for a long distance runner, I am a long distance runner, there is a problem of digesting. When on a long distance you have to digest food, and it's complicated because you're running and you're constantly in a sympathetic stimulation state. Does that make sense? We're basically done with, I'm going to throw a couple more, okay? So, reproductive, which is going to be slightly different. Reproductive is interesting. It's interesting because they both stimulate. Okay, now, so they both are stimulatory in males and females, but it's easier to demonstrate. It's not going to be on the exam. This mechanism is not going to be on the exam. I just want you to know that they work together, okay? It's easier to demonstrate using male sexual response. So basically, parasympathetic activation results in the dilation of blood vessels in the penis, increased blood flow and direction. That makes sense? Sympathetic activation results in the contraction of smooth muscles around the ejaculatory duct and ejaculation. You need both, okay? In females, it will be increased blood flow to the vagina, parasympathetic, and vaginal contractions to promote sperm towards the uterus and fallopian tubes. Does that make sense? So that's working together. Now, there are some responses that are unique for sympathetic branch, meaning that only sympathetic system does them, okay? And those responses are increased coagulation. Makes sense? If you're wounded, you need to plug those pipes. Increased cellular metabolism. Increased sweating. Again, folks, I am clearing my conscience. Okay? I have to say this, it will make no sense to you until the end of AP2. Increased renin production. So basically, renin, not for the exam, renin is a hormone that increases your blood pressure. Sympathetic stimulation results in the release of renin and increased blood pressure. Okay? I'm not going to ask this on the exam, God forbid. So far we good? So those are unique to sympathetic. Questions on this one? Okay. So let's talk about, yeah, good. We have really few words about the anomalies. That's going to be at the end, and I wanted to say a few words about adrenal medulla, which is kind of interesting. So I'm gonna kill this. because that's going to be a discussion of sympathetic branch. So sympathetic branch has kind of a unique mechanism of response. Check this out. So this is your spinal cord, okay? And this is adrenal gland. Okay. Those are pyramid-shaped glands that are located at the top of the kidneys, like sitting on top of the kidneys. Therefore, the term adrenal, above kidney. Adrenal gland, like many other glands in the human body, consists of the cortex, which is outer, and we don't care about it for now, and the inner part that is called medulla. So, adrenal medulla. Here's what happens. You have essentially preganglionic neuron that gets all the way to medulla. And in the medulla, it synapses with the special cells right here, which are called neuroendocrine cells. Okay? So these neuroendocrine cells, in essence, like if you want to be absolutely 100% pedantic, they are hugely transformed and changed post-ganglionic neurons. Very much changed, okay? Okay? Release norepinephrine and epinephrine in the blood. Okay? Clear? They do release epinephrine, norepinephrine in the blood. That gives sort of another dimension to the difference between the sympathetic versus parasympathetic responses. So, think of it this way. When you have parasympathetic response, again, it's very, very local. Your digestive, urinary, and a little bit in the head. When you have sympathetic stimulation, and I know I think this joke is, maybe it's in the notes, but, basically when you see transition from Bruce Banner to Hulk, that's sympathetic response of Bruce Banner. Nobody ever thought what would be the result of sympathetic activation in the Hulk. Well, now I can tell it's going to be Chuck Norris. So what happens, you have sympathetic activation, which will, through various fibers, stimulate your cardiac activity, will dilate your bronchi, inhibit digestive, and so on and so forth. But what's important, some of that signal will stimulate those neuroendocrine cells to release norepinephrine and epinephrine in the blood. Does it make sense? Which means they're going to be delivered everywhere. Which means, and it takes a lot of time to clear those things from the blood. So this is why if you get angry, it takes a while for you to calm down. That make sense? Good? Now, what about pathologies? Couple of things that a lot of diseases are indirectly dependent on the dysfunction of autonomic nervous system, okay? So, true sort of dysfunction, Raynaud's disease, which is probably genetic. Overactive sympathetic system results in the peripheral vasoconstriction. So small blood vessels, usually in the toes and your fingers, they constrict. Severity differs. Trigger is usually cold, okay? They constrict abnormally strongly. And people, like you can see, I have the pictures of these blue fingers. It can actually, if you don't control it, it can result in gangrene, okay? Autonomic dysreflexia. We have no idea what the mechanism is. What we know is that it's very characteristic for people with a spinal cord injury. So basically you have massive dilatory response above the injury, vasodilation, flushed face, spike in the blood pressure, like around the head, and you have massive vasoconstricting responses below the injury. Why? Don't know. A buddy of mine, as I told you about him before, he's quadriplegic. And trigger is often temperature as well. We had a swimming pool in the apartments, and I once told him, it was like early June, which was pretty hot in Louisiana. I told him, let's go. He was a phenomenal swimmer. Let's go swim. He said, too cold. And the water was like 82. So for him, the starting temperature that would not trigger this response was above 86, ideally closer to 90. Makes sense that there's some difference. We don't know why. The diseases that are indirectly connected, the classic example is hypertension. If you would look at a person, the broker who works at, say, a stock exchange, New York Stock Exchange, they have terrible health because it's a very stressful work. So they have sympathetic activation almost 100% of the time. That makes sense? So they have chronically high blood pressure due to this. But chronically high blood pressure results in blood vessel inflammation, blood vessel remodeling, which leads to atherosclerosis, increased probability of thrombotic events, and results in the remodeling of the circulatory system, so those folks end up with atherosclerosis, heart disease, and blood pressure. Okay? That's basically an explanation. Last little bit, I just like it. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are new terms for adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is not the example. But some of you may have seen the movie, which is called Pulp Fiction. And in that great movie, other folks who seen Pulp Fiction? Okay. So there's an episode when a character played by Uma Thurman experiences a bit of a conundrum with the heroin. So she basically overdoses and her heart stops. And the character of John Travolta grabs a syringe full of adrenaline and sticks it straight into the heart to kind of restart it. Except for piercing the thoracic cage into the heart, it's quite accurate. You don't need to stab the heart though, you just need to give it IV. And that would be enough. Okay? That makes sense? Other than that, it's pretty good. But yeah, the suspense. Any questions? All right.